Hi, this is Claudia Filos. I'm with the Center for Hellenic Studies. Today we have a special guest, Associate Professor Graeme Bird from Gordon College is joining us. He's going to talk with us about Homer and about jazz and ideas about improvisation and composition and performance. It should be a very fun discussion. So I'm really grateful to everyone for joining us today. We have some very cherished members of our community here today with us. And so I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves. Maybe with Jack, starting first.
Hi, I'm Jack Vaughn. I'm a semi-retired Texas attorney living in Houston, Texas, who was a classical scholar in my early days, and in semi-retirement, I'm back to that.
Hi, Jack.
And Renan.
Hi, my name is Renan. I am a student in Brazil, master student in classical archaeology.
Hi, Renan.
Thanks so much. And Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Scott, and I'm calling from Scotland.
Hi, Sarah.
And Ali. Oh, Ali, you're muted.
Whoops. So I'm Ali Marbury. I'm a programs coordinator at the Center for Hellenic Studies in DC, and also, obviously, lover of classics.
Thank you.
Hi, Ali.
And Bill.
Hi, I'm Bill Moulton from Petersburg, Alaska.
Hey, Bill.
Thanks so much. So, Graeme, thanks so much for joining us. Can you take just a minute to talk to us a bit about your research interests?
Yes. By the way, thank you all for being here. And one of my great interests is in, obviously, the study of Homer as it relates to, the study of jazz as it relates to Homeric composition and performance. My little book that I came out a couple of years ago, I dealt with the Ptolemaic papyri of Homer, the earliest papyrus manuscripts of Homer, and how the variants in their text differed significantly more from our so-called Vulgate text than most manuscripts. So I continue, when I have time, to do a little more research on that, on looking at the earliest variants of the Homeric text and what they might tell us about maybe the history of composition and performance. And then I love to play the piano, so I'm which is why I'm here today, to try and relate variations in jazz improvisation to Homer.
Right. So we should say you're sitting in front of a piano because you're also an accomplished musician. You're a professional on that front as well. You're really a polymath. Maybe at the end we can talk a bit about some of the many other things you do. For instance, you teach at Harvard Extension School. You teach a few courses that might be available to people either in the area or via distance. I'm not sure. We could talk about that. Yeah. So at the end we'll talk about that. But right now, why don't we start talking about Homer and jazz?
Yeah.
So I know you have a few focus passages that you've asked us to think about, and you're here at the piano. So how would you like to start, Graeme?
Well, where to begin? Actually, when I gave a little presentation about this topic a while back, we started doing a song called "I Can't Get Started." It was kind of a delicious irony, but. Yes, one of the focus passages I suggested was the first 8 lines of the Iliad, and I picked that because Albert Lord, in his book *The Singer of Tales*, on I forget what page, but we have a slide of this. He, as he was analyzing Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, he was focusing on what he called the formula, and just how formulaic is the Iliad, and what does it mean to have formulas? And that's actually been a big debate over the last 70 or 80 years as to what is a formula, what does it mean for Homer to be formulaic, and how does that connect with things like tradition and orality. So I understand that you folks have read these the beginning of the Iliad in English, and maybe some of you know some Greek. But why don't we look at it in English first? And Claudia is kindly putting up a slide that And this is from from Greg's book, The Hero in 24 Hours. Or is it from there? He's got the translation of the whole Iliad attached to it, linked to it. So let me read it here. This is from Greg's translation, and so here we go. This is Iliad, Scroll 1, verses 1 to 8, and I'll include. Greg puts the key Greek words in brackets after the English, just because they're so important. So, anger, Manus, goddess, sing it, of Achilles, son of Peleus. Disastrous, Ulomene, anger that made countless pains, Algea, for the Achaeans. And many steadfast lives, Psyche, it drove down to Hades. Heroes' lives, but their bodies it made prizes for dogs and for all birds. And the will of Zeus was reaching its fulfillment, Telos. Sing, starting from the point where the two, I now see it, first had a falling out, engaging in strife, Eris. I mean, and then Agamemnon is in brackets, the son of Atreus, lord of men, and radiant Achilles. So, which one of the gods was it who impelled the two to fight with each other in strife, Eris? So there's our first 8 lines in English. And could we maybe look at it in the Greek now? And this is from Albert Lord's book. And if you're able to see the slide, you'll see some underlines and dotted underlines that I'll talk about in a minute. But let me read it in Greek, the same first 8 lines. Menen aeda thea, peleia dio Achilleos, ulomenen, he muri echaios alge etheka. Polas difthi mus psychas aidi proiapsen, heroon, autus de heloria teucha kunesen, oio noisi te pasi, dios de telea tabule, ex hu de ta prota dias de ten eresanta, atra edes te anax andron kai dios Achilleus. Tistar svoe theon erudi xune eke majestai. So this is the first 8 lines in Greek. And if you're able to see, under the Greek you'll see dotted lines and you'll see solid lines. And Lord set this up. And there's lots of little footnotes after them that I didn't include. A solid line under a group of text means that that exact collection of words is repeated at least one other time somewhere in Homer. So in the very first line, the second half, Pelia dio Achilleos, occurs 7 times elsewhere in Homer's Iliad, so that phrase. So he defined that as formulaic, or as a formula. If you look down the line 7, it's made up of 3 solid lines, so it's got 3 formulas in the line, and the last one is Kai Dios Achilleus and Radiant Achilles. That occurs 53 times in Homer's Iliad. So that's obviously highly repeated, and for Parry and Lord, this was evidence of, after they did lots of research and study, evidence of orality and use of traditional formulas. As the performer is standing up performing and getting into the rush of the performance, he's not memorizing his story and he doesn't have a written script, but he's using this stock of formulas that he's learned over the years from listening to other performers. So the underline, the dotted underline refers to groups of words that are found very similarly elsewhere in the Iliad, but not necessarily identically repeated word for word. So you'll see that most of these lines, of the first 8 lines, like the first one, the whole thing has a dotted underline, meaning that something very similar to that occurs elsewhere in the Iliad. So one of Lord's goals, one of his results, was to show that the vast percentage of the Iliad and the Odyssey is made up of formulaic material. And then he ran with that and showed that this is great evidence of the poet working from tradition and being an oral poet. And of course, he backed this up with his studies from Serbo-Croatia, where there were living poets still performing formulaic type material, and they couldn't read. And so it was kind of a perfect parallel to Homer. So that's the first 8 lines of Iliad Scroll 1. So maybe I'll segue to a little jazz at this point. I actually came to America to study jazz, even though I already had a degree in classics. So when my students ask for career advice, I say, don't do what I did. I've had a non-linear path. But I'm fortunate that I was able to combine these two things. So if you know anything about jazz, you'll know that improvisation is one of the key concepts. And I was spurred on to do this sort of comparison study back when I was a music student at the Berklee College of Music, and the RD was doing a PhD at Harvard in music, and he was doing this very thing. But the interesting thing is, for Albert Lord, he didn't like the word improvisation, and he said, don't think of Homer as an improvising poet, because the word improvisation has kind of the wrong connotations. So, of course, I went to the ultimate source of word definitions, the Oxford English Dictionary, and sure enough, I don't think I have this on a slide, but you can go to the OED. Improvisation, according to the OED, to improvise, to compose verse or music, etc., on the spur of the moment, to utter or perform ex tempore, which is actually a pretty deficient definition. It sounds like you just sit down and you just kind of throw your hands on the piano and make something up. And that would actually sound pretty bad, and I wouldn't pay to go and hear that. So I sense that the word improvise, there's problems with how people understand what it means. And being an improviser myself, that's not what I do when I sit down to improvise. I don't just sit down and shut my eyes and bash keys randomly. I actually practice every day quite hard, and I practice things over and over again. I play the same songs, but of course I play them differently every time. And so the word improvise for many people does not have the necessary connotations of practice and using material that you've practiced in a performance. So either we have to find another word, or we have to rehabilitate the word improvisation. So I like the word, so I think one of my goals is to sort of rehabilitate its connotation and denotation.
So that's really beautiful. I think that's a really important clarification that you're sharing with us there, because, for instance, you can go online and see a video of Albert Lord talking about why improvisation really isn't a helpful word when you're thinking about this. But what you're saying is he's responding to this other more, let's say, typical understanding of improvisation, whereas maybe someone who has spent a lifetime in performance has a very different experience of what improvisation actually is.
Yeah, that's right, Claudia. Yes, thank you. And of course, who am I to disagree with Albert Lord on anything? I love the guy. I was lucky enough to sit in a couple of his classes.
Yes,
but,
yes, yes.
but I think you're right. I think maybe it had sort of bad connotations,
right.
And it was kind of not being used carefully enough.
Exactly. And so what I'm actually pointing out is that maybe there isn't so much disagreement there, because
right.
You're agreeing with
Right.
his point that people weren't making things up. You're just disagreeing about this definition of
The
improvisation.
word.
Right.
Exactly right.
So great. So let's
Yes.
see.
So
May I interject the question?
yes.
I took Jeff Helmer's MOOC earlier this year, Jazz Appreciation.
Yes.
And his working definition of improvisation was the instantaneous creation of a melody.
The instantaneous creation of a melody. Is he a performer himself, Jack?
Yes, he is. He's a professor of music at the University of Texas and a pianist. Contrasting with his definition, as he defines improvisation, is what he calls pre-composed melodies, and that would be like the fake book melody line that, or something that's pre-composed and played the same way every time. I'm sure Dave Brubeck had a lot of favorites that he had a certain, people were used to hearing a certain way, and so
that's really interesting, Jake. Let me run with that, because I mean, what I'm holding in my hand here is, which I think I came up with myself, but I've looked around hard to nuance this word. The prerequisites to improvisation are the use of pre-existing material. So I don't see a contrast between, in fact, jazz people use the word pre-composition. I think all improvisers use pre-composed material and material that they've worked on. So I don't see a contrast.
He breaks down the elements of a song, and then he has all these smaller elements like riffs and
riffs. That's a good word, riffs, which may be equivalent to formula, actually. The point I want to make is that any expert jazz musician, I don't claim to be an expert, but an expert will have practiced hundreds of hours. He or she will have worked over many, many riffs or musical motifs, and in a sense, he or she will have those as part of their stock inventory of material that they will draw on when improvising. Just as I'm beginning to understand, Homer and similar poets had a stock inventory of semantic and syntactic formulas. So let me the piece that I've illustrated is Night and Day, Jack. I'm sure you know that piece, by Cole Porter, classic sung by people like Frank Sinatra. I will not do any singing, but let me play the piece, or at least part of it, straight, which is, if you go to a fake book or a real book, it's funny how jazz people have these strange names for things. The real book is supposed to be an improvement on the fake book, as the name suggests. But either way, it's a set of chords and melody that you use to play the song straight, and then use it as a kind of a launching pad to play off. So let me play the whole piece through. It's an AABA form, and I'm playing it in C major. And I think our recording equipment, the higher notes will sound better than the lower, so you may not hear much bass. But let me play this anyway. Okay, so that's the basic melody with harmony, and oh, thank you. I've played that probably hundreds and hundreds of times, and I never get bored playing it because I never play it the same way twice, naturally. And I can vary the rhythm, the tempo, the harmony even, and then of course I start improvising as I'll do in a little bit. But anyone that knows the song will say, "Oh yeah, that's Night and Day." Now I'm going to illustrate with a few little melodic fragments or formulas. I'm going to call them formulas. The kinds of things that I'm going to put in when I start improvising. So I'm going to have this one. I don't know if you can hear that. These are 16th notes, and let's see. Okay, that's a kind of a, we call it an 8th note swing pattern. What else have I got? Okay, that kind of thing. So let me play. Again, I'm going to improvise now on this piece, and I'm going to put some of these little melodic fragments in. And there's a tension between, as Homer scholars argue, I think for decades, and maybe still do, if Homer is just using pre-composed formulas, and if he's filling them in, you know, putting them into metrical slots, as I'm sure you may have read about, where does he get his creativity from? How can a poet that is using stuff that's already there, constrained by the meter, how can we claim that he has any individuality or creativity at all? And some of the arguments have gotten quite unpleasant, I think, between scholars, saying that no, if you go too far in the sort of hard Pariist direction and say everything is formulas, then Homer is just a sort of a mechanical poet. And then on the other side, people denying that there's anything oral at all. So there's been some extremes. And I imagine that the truth is, as usual, somewhere in the middle, maybe closer to one side than the other. But with jazz as well, whenever a jazz musician is playing, chances are 90% of the time they're using material that they've practiced hard in their I was going to say in their study. No, it's called the woodshed, by the way. Jazz musicians go out to the woodshed and practice, and sometimes their practice, it's called shedding because they're in the woodshed.
That's a nice metaphor.
So yes, so when I was at Berklee College of Music, people would say, I need to go and shed for a couple of hours, which didn't mean all their hair was going to fall on the ground. But so I have lots of happy memories of shedding at Berklee. So a good jazz musician, they sound amazing, they sound creative, but if you listen really closely, you'll hear that they are using repeated pre-composed material, and there's no contradiction between being creative and using material that they've played before. Right. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I couldn't get any experts in here today, so that's why I'm here. Yes, Claudia.
Graeme, so can I ask a question? Yes. Or I guess insert a comment, really. I think people who have been studying languages recently have been realizing, in fact, that as we speak, almost everything that we say is formulaic ourselves, right? Even as speakers, in terms of the performance of our own conversations and dialogues with people. So for us, I think sometimes when we hear this idea of formulaic, it feels very rigid, but as really it's about a system that facilitates communication and creativity, right? Yes,
no, that's good. Thanks, Claudia. Yes, and I was just rereading in the new companion to Homer, there's a really good chapter on the formula by Russo, and he was talking about how Lord even kind of hinted at that, and then Michael Nagler and his new definition of the formula, and I think one or two others, that yes, whenever we speak, we're using bits of language that obviously have been used before, otherwise we wouldn't get very far.
I mean, ask someone at the table to pass you the pepper and the salt.
Yes.
I mean, just how uncomfortable that feels, and there's nothing compelling you to say salt and pepper, but right?
Right. So no, that's good. That's good. So so let me play a little bit of this, and I actually have a written out improvised line, which sounds very counterintuitive, because supposedly improvisers can't read or write, but actually they can now, because otherwise they won't be able to make a living. So I'm going to play my written out improvisation that I actually worked out. Maybe this is my oral dictated text, to use Lord's language. And you may hear, hopefully you will hear some repeated motivic things going on, and hopefully it will sound vaguely creative, but I'll leave you to judge. So could you still tell that was night and day? Now, can I ask you, how could you tell that was still night and day?
I could still hear the melody. I could hear bits and pieces of it.
Yeah, bits and pieces of the original melody.
Right.
Yes. And maybe, I don't know what the bass and harmony was like, but you might have heard a similar underlying harmonic structure. So I'm kind of exploring those as analogies for, you know, the poet tells the story of the Iliad. We all know sort of the basic story of Helen gets abducted, and then the Greeks come to Troy, and then certain important people get killed, ending up with Hector. But the ways of telling that story are myriad. Similarly, night and day, there's a basic harmonic underlying structure of that and the melody. But I can vary it as much as I want. You'll still know that it's still the same piece. I don't know, could you hear some sort of formulaic, some repeated little phrases that I was trying to put in? And again, one of the hard things for me is I look for an expert jazz musician, and unfortunately they often don't live very long. Bill Evans was, I missed him by a couple of years, but he was actually the person who this researcher at Harvard used when he was studying jazz improvisation. He's such a brilliant player. Trying to analyze his material was kind of mind-boggling. So I employed a little hubris and decided to use my own material because it's simpler, and I thought I could illustrate it that way. Let's move on a little bit, but please feel free if you have questions.
Do you have the Bill Evans fake book?
Jack, you mean the one that has his name on it?
Yes.
I'm not sure that I do. I have about 15 fake books on my laptop, but I don't think
It's still in print. I have it. It's beautiful. It's his songs, and I was amazed at how many chords, above sevenths that he has in there.
Now you're getting technical, Jack, which I like. I'm not sure if you all know what he means by chords above sevenths. Let me just digress a little, because that's actually a really interesting thing. If you studied classical music, you'd know that you have your major triad, but then if you keep going, you've got your major seventh, and if you keep going, your major ninth, and then if you keep going, your major 11th. And Jack's, I think, alluding to the fact that jazz musicians don't really like simple harmony. They really like to get sophisticated with harmony and reharmonize. And that's actually a way of improvising, is to take straight ahead harmony and just explore the richness of reharmonization. And Bill Evans, yes, was an expert in that. He was, I think, considered as one of the greatest ever. So what I'm focusing on more today is melodic improvisation, but you're right, harmonic is a big part of the whole thing.
Graeme,
yes.
I'm sorry, can I ask,
yes.
We have a question from our audience.
Yes.
So is this a good time to take a question?
Yes, anytime.
Great,
yes.
and then I have
I like to improvise.
Great, and then I have a question about audiences too.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jenna Cole, another very cherished member of our community, is asking, is there a relationship between local, that is geographic variations in formulaic passages and their frequency or context?
In jazz or harmony?
Well, and does this also occur in jazz and regional styles?
Well, that's a really... Now, what was the person's name again?
Jenna.
Jenna. That's a great question, Jenna. Let me think here. The thing about Homer is that Homer's poetry has this kind of universal sort of pan-Hellenic quality to it. And I think I'm sure that I can't think of any good local examples right now, although in the catalogue of ships in Book 2 of the Iliad, there are all the lists of who came from where, and there's even a dispute as to whether one or two of the lines that mention Athens should even be in there, which sounds like a local dispute or something going on. as I understand it, the Homeric language is fairly widespread. I'm not aware of any really standout type local passages. In jazz, yes, the nationality of the performer is going to have a big impact on what it sounds like. And there are different jazz styles. There's bebop and swing and cool jazz, but then there's also bossa nova and Latin type rhythms that will have a Brazilian or a South American flavor to them. Then of course there's blues, which I absolutely love. In fact, maybe I'll do that right now.
Yes, thank you.
I'll add a little blues flavor to Night and Day, which, let's face it, like Night and Day is a love song. Someone is, Night and Day, I think about you night and day, so they're obviously apart. And there's some kind of pain and sort of one person missing the other. So that sounds like an ideal, if you want to make it sound really bluesy. So let's see what I can do with the blues scale. Okay, that sound bluesy? So I like to explore that. Jenna, I don't know if that totally answers your question, but it's possible to flavor different passages with different types of feel that I guess could be considered geographical. So that's a good question, to think more about that.
Well, thank you, and thanks for presenting that variation on the spot in response to your audience, right? So at some point, I hope maybe through a conversation we could talk about the participatory group.
Right.
Greg will call the audience. So, but I didn't want to interrupt too much. So
no, but next? Interruptions are actually good.
Okay.
But let me maybe relate this a little bit to my talk about the research on the Ptolemaic papyri. And I think one of the other passages that you were given to look at was from Iliad Book 3, which was the...
Should I pull that up?
Yes, yeah, thanks. The arming.
And just so everyone knows that Graham's book is called Multitextuality in the Homeric Iliad, the Witness of the Ptolemaic Papyri, and that's actually it's available for free on the Center for Hellenic Studies website. You can also get it in print from Harvard University Press. It's a very beautiful book.
Thank you. And you know what? I think I forgot to print out Greg's translation of this.
That's okay.
I don't know if I can see
That's
it there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to bring it up in 1 second. Okay.
So I have one in front of me which is not Greg's translation. Let me just talk about it for a minute. So you might remember in Book 3 of the Iliad, everyone's sitting down and they're deciding, why don't we have a one-on-one duel, and guess who the two that end up fighting each other, Paris and Menelaus, which kind of makes sense since they're, if you like, fighting over the same woman. Although it says that they were chosen by lot, but it was a pretty auspicious lot. So yeah, I can't see the original there. Is that okay?
That's fine, or I can read it.
Well, do you want to read it?
Sure.
Will they be able to hear you?
I think so. Can you hear me? People nodding?
Can you hear Claudia? Yes, they're nodding.
Great.
So Claudia's
Okay.
going to read the Book 3 arming scene of Paris and Menelaus.
Okay.
Okay.
First he, Paris, put the greaves around his legs, fine ones, fitted with silver ankle pieces. Second, he put on his breastplate about his chest. Of his brother Lycaon, and fitted it to himself. And about his shoulders he threw his silver-studded sword of bronze, and then his shield, great and sturdy. And upon his mighty head he put a well-made helmet with horsehair crest, and terribly did the plume nod from above. And he took a stout spear, which fitted his hands, and likewise warlike Menelaus donned his battle gear.
Actually, that's the one that I have. So I think that's okay. So I think that's maybe slightly different from what you're looking at. We all know what's going on, right? So my apologies for giving you the wrong one. But anyway, this is, if you've read all of the Iliad, this might remind you of some other arming scenes in the Iliad where people put their weapons on. So what's another classic example of someone arming up for battle? Anyone think of one?
Hopefully.
Agamemnon.
So Agamemnon in Book 11, Jack, what was the one you said?
Oh, I was thinking of Patroclus.
Proclus.
And then, of course, Achilles in book 19.
Yes, and then, of course, Achilles before going to fight Hector. And if you put those passages side by side, you'll see some of them just repeat lines or even groups of lines, and one of the obvious reasons is, how many ways are there of putting a shield and greaves on and all of this. Of course, when you look at Agamemnon's, that's one of the most grandiose ones, because in between the formulaic repeated lines, other lines are inserted about what's on his shield and how Athena and Hera get so excited watching him put his weapons on, they let loose a crack of thunder and all of this, which Paris certainly doesn't get. So what Claudia just read is sort of the standard, or what some people call the Vulgate text, the one that you'd probably find in like in Martin West's edition of the Iliad or whatever translation that you're reading. But going back to the 3rd century BCE, a papyrus was discovered that I talk about it in my book, P40, I think it's P40, that actually had this passage with some extra lines at the end, because how many lines does Menelaus get to put on his weapons in the version that Claudia just read? I mean, he gets one line, and likewise, warlike Menelaus donned his battle gear. And you can imagine, again, I'm using my imagination here, that a performer who's performing this on a particular evening, maybe he was in a Menelaus frame of mind and thought, I'm going to give Menelaus a few more lines. And so let me read the version that has the extra lines, and we'll talk about what we mean by extra as well. So the last 2 lines that Claudia read started with, and he took a stout spear. So the papyrus actually says, and he took 2 stout spears tipped with bronze. And then we get the Menelaus. And likewise, Menelaus donned his warlike armor, so that's a bit different, his shield and shining helmet and 2 spears and fine greaves fitted with ankle pieces, and about his shoulders he threw his silver-studded sword. So Menelaus gets 4 lines instead of 1. And it's very interesting, and I try to explore this in my book. How do you choose between one of these versions? And then take a step back and say, well, should you even have to choose between one of these versions? And the Homer multitext project that many of you may be familiar with thinks that you shouldn't have to choose between one of these versions, that they're all worth considering and even presenting maybe side by side, so that you can see maybe how the Homeric tradition was maybe changing or evolving over time, or how its multitextuality, how this was being manifested, how different performances, maybe even at the same time, were taking place. But of course, traditionally, people have wanted to find one right version, one original. Well, we have a question, Sarah.
Yes, one of the things I immediately noticed about the unfamiliar Menelaus passage was that the order of the armor was different. All the other passages where people are putting on armor, they start with the greaves. They might not actually mention very much else. They always start with the greaves, and that one didn't, because I was tracking those passages. So that was interesting, because what you were talking about with the jazz, that you maybe kind of change some of the orders of some of the notes. Is that an analogy that you would, does that work?
I do like that as an analogy, and especially because I'm not sure why the ankle greaves are mentioned last in this Ptolemaic passage, because you're right, they usually come first. And if you're kind of a critical judging type person, you'll say, oh, well, this can't be right because the greaves got mentioned in the wrong order. But I like your approach, Sarah, which is a more open, flexible approach, which is maybe in the heat of the performance, a decision was a subconscious or a conscious decision was made to mention them last. I can't give a good reason why, but in jazz, of course,
it's the only place where I think you've got 2 people arming one straight after the other. Everywhere else, it's just one person is focused, and then it's, you know, and everybody else put their armor on. That's the only time you've got the two. So you've got that kind of, you know, one, and then kind of the other kind of not quite mirroring it, but could be a reason. Really just a thought. Just a thought.
No, but I think, you know, maybe for variety, why would you want to repeat the second guy doing things in exactly the same order as the first? Maybe there's a little sort of ring composition going on. Greaves first here, Greaves last here. Some kind of structural thing going on. I like that. I think there's room to explore this some more.
That's beautiful. And you know what you just said about variation there, right?
Yeah.
Why would you want to vary? Or you would want to vary. You wouldn't want to repeat it. And for us, having very noticeable variations like that sometimes doesn't, to our modern aesthetic, doesn't make sense. But I think one of the things that Lenny has argued in one of his books is that there is an aesthetic variation. And so that both brings about preservation of traditional phrases and formula, and at the same time facilitates the creation of new.
I like that.
Yeah.
Thank you both. That's really good. It's funny how modern audiences sometimes seem to want to have it both ways. We don't want to have all this repetition. But then if someone does something in a different order, we're not happy with that either. So, you know, we need to lighten up a little maybe. Like, need to become like jazz musicians. That's good, yeah. Also, the word for helmet and a couple of the actual vocab words are different in the, I don't have the Greek in front of me, in the longer version. So not only the order, but even some of the vocab. So if you're checking the word for shield and sword and spear, I think there's some variation in vocabulary, which is even more exciting, right? That,
absolutely, I'm going to have to check that passage out. Thank you.
Yes, I think so. This would be a fun one. I think I need to read over it again. I did read over it many times, but you never get everything right. There's always something more. Now, I'm seeing a question on the screen.
Thank you.
By William Moulton. Shall I read it out?
Oh, that would be great.
So, is there a rule of thumb to avoid overreaching when improvising? For example, when a classic movie is remade, sometimes the director and writer redo the material so badly that the audience rejects it and the movie is a flop. How do musical improvisers avoid the same mistake? Wow, that's a great question. So when does jazz become a flop? William, that's a great question. I think it's easier to judge with, well, audience are quicker to judge things like movies because they remember the original, don't they, so passionately that anything that strays too far is taking a giant risk. There is a lot of personal taste in jazz. There's jazz that, in fact, that's a good topic that I'm going to bring up. There's degrees of improvisation. In fact, let me, and this is from the Harvard Dictionary of Music, which is a great book. The first degree of improvisation they call is embellishment. So you just play with the melody a little bit. So instead of so here's the melody. So I embellish a little. Just, you know, a few little above and below approach notes and things. I don't think anyone complains about that. Degree 2 is called a paraphrase. I love that because that sounds like what you would use for language, right? And let me read this. A paraphrase in jazz is a more subtle transformation of precomposed material in which original and additional notes blend into a new melody of homogeneous design. And let me listen to this last bit as I read this. The performer passes from interpreter to composer. Isn't that great? So the person performing the piece now becomes a composer, sort of in concert with the original composer. So, so I think that is still, most people would say this is okay. This is sort of within the bounds of acceptable improvisation. I mean, who's the judge, right? And then type 3, this is the third degree of improvisation, called harmonic improvisation. The improvised melody may not resemble the original melody, but it still follows the underlying harmonic structure. A listener with good ears, and at Berkeley we called it someone with giant ears. The better you were, the bigger your ears were, which sounds kind of funny. A person with good ears can tell that the performer is improvising over night and day. But William, I'm wondering if you're getting at something called progressive jazz, where musicians get together and you don't actually know what they're playing. You can't tap your foot to it because you can't even tell, is it 4/4, 5/4, 6.5/4. There are groups like that in the Boston area here. They have a limited but I think very devoted audience. Even there's a professor here at Gordon College who's into, you know, the weirder the better. But I think that's where personal taste takes over. That myself, I prefer to actually be able to recognize the tune and the underlying harmony, and if I can't tap my foot or recognize what it is, then I think I get left behind. So I think it's a very personal thing. But I like that question, a rule of thumb. So I don't think there is a rule of thumb. I think it's personal taste. So that's a great question.
Graeme, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Because I feel like these categories you're outlining for us are quite interesting, especially in terms of some of the vocabulary you're using. So for instance, that second category, now we're talking about composition, right?
Yes.
And I'm thinking about the way that as we think about the performance of, let's say, something like the Iliad, the Homeric Iliad and the Odyssey, that we're thinking about the fact that the performer is composing in the moment of performance,
yes.
right? And then this third level sort of takes us beyond that to a point where things would not be recognizable. And I'm wondering, I mean, is that something that would be sustainable, let's say, within a traditional song culture like ancient Greece? I mean, what happens if you try to sing the anger of Achilles and it is not recognizable? I mean, that seems like that's not something that would, you know, as we're talking about personal taste and we're talking about composition, I mean, I think the performer's trying to meet the needs of his audience and to tell the story, but he's not trying to extend beyond what is faded, right? What's beyond tradition, or am I wrong? How does that work?
That's good. So maybe there is, to go back to William's idea, there is maybe a built-in rule of thumb that says the audience will tolerate so much and no more. And maybe there was a singer that did the anger of Achilles and he took it so far out, to use jazz terminology, that no one could recognize it, and maybe he didn't survive. Right. And so we don't know about it because, you know, the tradition kind of has filters maybe to keep certain stuff survives and other stuff doesn't make it.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, but it's interesting to think about as we think about this relationship between, as we think about composition and performance in jazz, and as we think about composition and performance in Homeric poetry, it's interesting to think about where we have things that are working together, where they might be separating a bit. It's super fascinating.
It is, and one of my the books that I read a lot when I was writing my book was by Stephanie West, which is Martin West's wife. She wrote a book in 1967 called The Ptolemaic Papyri. The title is much simpler than mine. But she analyzed, as far as I recall, all of the ones that had been discovered so far. And Ptolemaic refers to the period, sort of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries BCE. I remember there were a few places where she said the papyrus, from the fragment of the line that survives, the papyrus seems to be telling a story of which we have no other knowledge. And it's so tantalizing that that maybe the papyrus is going off in this different direction, as you suggest, Claudia, and we only have like part of a line, and then we just have to use our imagination and wonder what on earth was this going to be, but it sort of rotted away in the sands of Egypt, kind of thing. So.
But then again, for us, it's hard to judge because we're not in the system, and those could be very traditional multiforms.
Exactly. And of course, we know about the quarrel in the Iliad. The quarrel is between Agamemnon and Achilles, and then in the Odyssey, Book 8, it's a different quarrel, right, between Odysseus and Achilles. Am I getting that right? Yes, and Agamemnon is happy to see it, right?
Great.
So a different quarrel, but we have lots of support as to, we don't know as much about that quarrel as we do about the one in the Iliad, but at least it survived.
So I think Bill and Renan both have questions.
Yes.
So maybe, Renan, would you like to ask your question first? Oh, Renan, you're still muted.
Yes. I can ask about the relationship between the composer and the audience. Sometimes this relationship can raise some tensions between the the composer and the audience.
Okay, I didn't catch the very beginning of that, Renan. Could you repeat it?
Yes, I wonder about the relationship between composer and audience. This relationship can rise sometimes some tensions because the audience can set the humor of the composer.
Yes. No, I agree. And you're from Brazil, right?
Yes.
So I have a favorite YouTube video from Antonio Carlos Jobim, who's one of your great bossa nova,
I know.
playing the song Wave. I don't know if you know the song Wave.
Onda. Wave. Onda.
This.
Onda.
I'm sure you know
Very
that.
famous here.
Yeah. And he had Herbie Hancock on there playing piano along with Carlos Jobim. So they were both sitting side by side at the same piano. But yes, so the interaction between audience in a good jazz performance, of course the audience will applaud after one of the musicians has finished their solo, and then sometimes they will start showing emotion during the solo, and they will maybe, if the soloist does something very inspiring, the audience will maybe cheer, clap, shriek, and maybe drive them on to higher things. So is that kind of what you're getting at? That's a wonderful thing to experience, by the way.
I was just going to ask you, can you talk a little bit, what does that actually feel like in the moment?
If you're the performer, it feels wonderful to feel that support from people, but more often I'm on the other side. Just your emotions kind of just rise up, and you feel this musician is in another world, or they're being transported, they're inspired. Maybe they're even exploring things that even they maybe never tried before. They're kind of going outside, pushing the boundaries. And you just want to kind of cheer and encourage them, and you just want to hear more. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but that's what I was feeling from your question.
And Bill also had a question.
Okay.
Yeah, my question is kind of the same lines as Renan's. I didn't have the language before we had that discussion about improvisation, but the extra 4 lines from Menelaus' arming scene, that sounded to me like embellishment rather than composition. Like you're singing along and, oh wait, these people are descendants of Menelaus, I better add a couple more lines here. which would explain the deviation from the standard arming from the feet up.
So are you talking about expansion and contraction, Bill, or are you talking, when you say embellishment, what are you actually...
Well, we were talking about in jazz, you can embellish or you can actually compose in the moment. So generally speaking, when we're talking about Homeric poetry, we're assuming it's composition. But embellishment, to me, implies not such a grand plotting out of what you're doing here, just something you could slip in at the last minute.
I mean, I see all of the 3 levels as improvisation, and hence composition to some degree. It's true, we have to be careful with the nuances of each of the terms, but so I'm not sure if I see these extra lines in the Iliad 3 as embellishment. I guess it depends what we mean by that. The Harvard Dictionary of Music is taking an embellishment. That would be like a minor variation within a line. They would call that embellishment. And Claudia suggested this is kind of an example of expansion, as we know as expansion and contraction. More expansion are very Homeric things. It's interesting that we call them extra lines, additional lines. They've been denigrated too and been called interpolated lines, as if they don't belong. And I think that phrase, I think it's still used quite a bit. And there's been debates as to, let's find the genuine lines and throw out the interpolated lines. And that obviously is coming from a presupposition that there's one unique fixed text, and I think most of us don't really believe that. But that's interesting. I'm not sure that I see that as embellishment, but I see it, as you also suggest, a reaction to a particular audience, maybe. As you say, what he saw, descendants of Menelaus sitting in front of him, and he thought he'd better give them a few points. it could be a scary prospect. Of course, in jazz, there's no such thing as additional lines. It's just you keep playing. There's a famous example of one of Duke Ellington's saxophone players, Paul Gonsalves, who I think it was at the Newport Jazz Festival. They were playing the blues, which is a straightforward sort of 12-bar pattern. And do you remember do you remember how many times he played his chorus?
Oh, it went on for hours. I mean, you know, you've got to keep going. The crowd is with you.
But yeah, the crowd was so good that instead of playing 2 or 3 like everyone else, he just kept going for 27. And the crowd must have been amazing to be there. And so I wonder if that kind of thing happened in Homer's time too. That would have been quite something to witness.
Well, you know, Hans Joachim Meta had the idea that the Maenus of the Iliad was, I'm updating the language a little bit, an improvisation of an older epic of the Maenus of Meleager, which survives in that piece in Book 9 in the embassy scene where Phoenix talks about the wrath of Meleager.
There's so many good possibilities.
You know, unfortunately, we're getting
I'm
close
looking
to
at the
noon.
clock.
Exactly,
Yes,
and I know
yes.
you have another engagement.
No,
so
but I've got a few minutes, 5-10 minutes, if that's what we should do.
Yeah, so maybe we could just finish up. I mean, I know we didn't get to everything we could talk about. There's so much that we could talk about with you. And so I just want everyone to know, first of all, just a reminder, Graeme, can you talk about the 2 classes that you teach at Harvard Extension?
Yes. My second job, my moonlighting job is as a lecturer in Extension at the Harvard Extension School, and those are 2 math courses. And quick funny digression, I teach math in the summer, and I was preparing my slides for my math class, and I was doing exponential growth, and we have the formula for exponential growth, and I suddenly realized my slide said the flexibility of the formula, and it was a math formula, and I laughed because I thought, this is wild. But anyway,
But hold on, but one of your math courses is related to the Greeks, right?
and in the spring I teach math and the Greeks. So that's available online. If any of you, in fact, I had a whole bunch of people from Texas this past spring. So we look at mathematics the way that the ancient Greeks thought about it, starting with Thales, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and some others. We do a little bit of drawing geometry. We do a little bit of number theory, prime and perfect numbers. Teleos, which is the word for perfect numbers, which sounds like telos, which it is related to. And I make them learn the Greek alphabet, so you folks would, I think, have an advantage. So yes, that's one of my other things that I like to do.
Great. And Graeme, and also I just want to let everyone know that Professor Bird is going to be joining us as a member of the Board of Readers for the 3rd session of Heroes X, which will be starting on September 2nd. So we're really delighted to have him. You know, you have actually, in addition to all these other things, you have lots of other interests and specialties, actually. You can talk about historical linguistics, Christian literature, Latin literature. I could go on and on. So, but we'll get to introduce Graeme a little bit more in that context. I'm really looking forward to helping him connect with our community.
She's the tech expert. She'll help me get
Not at all.
hooked up. Yeah.
Not at all. So, you guys, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope we can have another discussion with Graeme Sunday soon.
Yes, thanks, Claudia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Encore.
Thank you.
Repeat performance.